Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. Now, the breaking news story of the past 24 hours or so has been the UAE normalizing its relations with Israel. Certainly, it's not been a secret that the United Arab Emirates and Israel have had relations for a significant amount of time now, at least behind the scenes, with even rumored trips, I should say, an underline of even Netanyahu possibly to the UAE to finalize this sort of normalization at this time. One wonders about the timing. Why now? Why would the UAE choose to do this right at this point? There have been theories about possible deflection from the protests that are taking place in Israel right now against Netanyahu's handling of the pandemic, his various cases at this point in time. The issue of annexation at this point, as we know, has been paused. But even on that, Netanyahu has said that will still very much go ahead at some point in the near future if he so gets his way, although the UAE itself says that the deal that it signed with Israel pauses or suspends or even stops, according to some accounts, that annexation altogether of the occupied West Bank, which has been such a bone of contention at this time. Who gains? Because the Palestinian Authority certainly was not aware of this, at least according to the public statements that they have made. Hanan Ashrawi, for example, has come out quite strongly against this move. Palestine has also recalled its ambassador from the UAE as well. Where does this all head for the Palestinians then? Because they're the ones who continually seem to be the ones left out. And, you know, with many countries now normalizing relations, I mean, the UAE, this decision is, of course, huge and could possibly, of course, also have a domino effect on other countries in the region to do so also. Where does that leave then any peace process between Israelis and Palestinians at this time? Let's discuss all of those issues a bit further. We're now joined by Kamel, who is the chair of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign UK. He's an academic at the University of Birmingham. He's joining us now from Birmingham. Joining us from Syracuse, New York this morning is Osamah Khalil, who is an associate professor of history at Syracuse University's Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. He's a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. And joining us from the Jordanian capital, Amman, is Daoud Kuttab, who is a columnist and director general of the Community Media Network. Daoud, Osamah, and Kamel, thank you to all three of you for your time today. Osamah, let me start with you. I just wanted to get your reaction. What do you make of this normalization of ties at this time?
Well, as you mentioned in your opening remarks, it's not a surprise. There have been secret relations for some time. They've expanded really over the past 5 or 6 years as part of the attempt to contain Iranian influence in the region. The UAE has relied on Israel for technology to help monitor activists within its country. It's also coordinated with Israel in a couple of secret campaigns, including inside Syria, also potentially within Yemen, from what we're hearing. So that's not really a surprise. There had been a lot of hints that this was coming. And in fact, it was really more a question of when it was going to happen, not if it was going to happen. And as you mentioned, this really has to do with domestic politics, both in the United States and in Israel, this announcement. President Trump here in the United States is facing a very difficult re-election campaign. And this is in part to help him secure two things. One, the base of evangelical voters that have been quite devoted to him before the COVID-19 pandemic and actually would view this favorably. The other thing it would actually help with is his key donors, including individuals like Sheldon Adelson, right? So Sheldon Adelson was the big major donor during the 2016 campaign, again in the 2018 midterm elections. But he has been a little stingy this time around, and there have been reports that there are some difficulties between he and Trump. And this kind of decision, or pushing forward this decision, especially since it's going to be the beginning of, from what we can tell, several other major announcements in the coming weeks and months leading into the election by other countries in the Gulf, that this would actually help Trump and perhaps open up some of the purse strings from key pro-Israel donors leading into the campaign in November, the election in November, rather.
Right. Kamel, I wonder where your reaction was, right? Because UAE officials, as you well know, have their narrative is that, listen, we've, at this point in time, been able to achieve this suspension, at the very least, of this annexation of the occupied West Bank, which was a huge, as you know, bone of contention and came under criticism even from Israel's allies. Is that enough of a reason? What do you think is really happening behind the scenes?
I think I agree with Osamah that it wasn't a surprise. I think, in a way, the shock was, first of all, it broke, the United Arab Emirates broke ranks with the Arab League initiative, which basically predicated this sort of normalization, if you like, on Israel ending the occupation of Arab land. So this normalization comes to almost approve the annexation of East Jerusalem, to approve the annexation of the Golan Heights, but to say, we're looking for a suspension of this annexation, which Netanyahu has already declared is going to happen. Netanyahu is very willing to take wins while Trump is in office, and if it is this, but rather than annexation, then he's prepared to take it and then find the right time to bring people along to accept the de jure annexation, because we all know that, first of all, from a security point of view, Israel has said that effectively it's annexed the whole land between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean. This is a matter of in a de facto way, that even under the Trump plan, the Palestinians would run their own affairs from a security point of view. But if they fail to achieve what Israel wants them to do, then the Israeli troops can still go into these Palestinian areas. But it's also a case of implementing the deal of the century without actually having it agreed by the various parties that has taken place now. This is an element of it.
You know, Daoud, the argument in many quarters, and these are not new arguments, certainly, is that it's better to have relations with Israel and then to pressure it into doing, quote unquote, the right thing vis-a-vis Palestinians. What do you make of that?
Well, this is a deal where all three parties have been scraping the bottom to try to find something to get out of their own problems. Netanyahu is facing corruption charges. He's having problems with his own partners. And Trump is losing in the polls of the next election. So it's not really an agreement that is made out of free will. It's made because people are trying to get out of their negative positions. And it basically removes an element of pressure that can be used on Israel to withdraw from territories. The whole idea of normalization was set as a kind of a reply or as an incentive for Israel to withdraw. Now that you remove this incentive, why would Israel withdraw from the occupied territories? It's weakening the Palestinian and Arab negotiating position for nothing. The Emiratis got nothing out of this. They got a promise of and not clear how long it will be postponement annexation, which already was postponed. So what did they get out of it? They might have gotten better relations with America, but they certainly didn't get anything for Palestinians out of this.
You know, Osamah, we agree that certainly there are a lot of domestic issues on behalf of all three of these parties as to why they may have come to this decision together. But nevertheless, this does affect Palestinians, right? This does affect the reality on the ground somehow. What would that effect be, do you think?
Well, I think we need to be very clear that annexation is not one of these things that has just turned on. Annexation has been underway since June 1967, since Israel seized these territories in the June 1967 war. So there's been a creeping annexation of Palestinian territories, of Arab territories, whether it was in the Golan Heights. And immediately after the June war, it's important to remember, Israel annexed East Jerusalem. Now, this was not recognized by the international community or the United States, although the United States did very little to really prevent it and to undermine it. In fact, it wasn't until the Trump administration that this annexation was recognized. So what we're actually seeing, and what has been underway, and really underway since even more aggressively since 2000, since the collapse of negotiations 20 years ago at Camp David and then the subsequent Palestinian Intifada, has been a more forceful campaign of annexation and seizing Palestinian lands. What Israel's always wanted is the following: the most land with the fewest Palestinians. But they've done it quietly. What we've seen actually since the Trump's deal of the century was announced was that Netanyahu had decided that we're going to do it openly. We're going to openly declare annexation, right? And so this, of course, is in the typical Netanyahu fashion. It led to a big uproar in certain capitals, and it actually allowed some attention to be drawn to it. But even though this is, quote unquote, on hold, nobody on the ground expects this to really end. Israel is not going to stop annexation. It's not going to stop building settlements. And it's not going to stop its seizures, for example, of the Jordan River Valley. This is all underway. This has been a long-term process shared by two parties, both the Labour and the Likud parties. Netanyahu didn't invent this, but he's going to be the one, as he sees it, to complete it.
So then, once again, where does this leave the Palestinians? As I said, Palestine's recalled its ambassador from the UAE, Hanan Ashrawi, and of course other Palestinian officials have come out quite strongly. Hanan Ashrawi saying we're not, we're nobody's fig leaf. She directly responded to the tweet of Mohammed bin Zayed and his announcement. These are very strong statements. Does this weaken the PA's hand?
Well, I mean, first of all, what is clear is that the PA does not have a plan. Either before annexation was announced or since. It's very much a reaction to what happens rather than sort of a clear vision as to how to achieve peace and end to the division within the Palestinian, amongst Palestinians themselves. But then going to the world with a unified voice which says, this is what we want, we have rights, I don't like to say to play the victim, but they are the victim. The Palestinians are the victim. They have strength in the demography, which was referred to a minute ago. I mean, half the people who live in that land, 6 million people or thereabouts, are not Jewish Israelis. Now, that can't be swept under the carpet, because over time, and if they continue to grow in numbers, they will be much higher in number than Jewish Israelis. And there may be other reasons why some Jewish Israelis will give up on this state and leave. So the time will come when Palestinians can begin to strengthen their hand. It is very weak at the moment, but I don't think there is a clear strategy that they can put to the world and say, we as campaigners for the rights of the Palestinians in various countries can say, this is the clear demand, this is what they want us to do. Where that comes from, in fact, it comes from civil society through the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement, which I think will now grow even bigger, because people will look at the situation the Palestinians are in and say, how can I help? And a really clear way of doing that is supporting BDS. Because looking at governments around the world, I mean, here in the UK, the foreign secretary has come out in favor of this. He thinks it's going to help with peace and called on the Palestinians to return. And indeed, even the shadow foreign secretary has come out with some similar nonsense, frankly, which says that this could lead to peace. There's no way this is going to contribute to peace, because the Palestinians will not capitulate, and until they realize their rights, there will be no peace.
Daoud, I would think that this would have been, or this must have been quite a risky decision, right, on the part of Mohammed bin Zayed and the UAE establishment, considering we know that for a very long time, at least until now, Palestine has been an extremely important issue, hasn't it, for Arabs across, many of these Arab countries in the region. Do you think that has changed? Has Palestine become now a back burner issue even for the people?
I'm not sure it's really connected to Palestine as much as it is connected to economics. The UAE depends on two things. It depends on oil and depends on tourism. The coronavirus has caused a huge dent in both the price of oil and in the travel industry. And UAE is suffering economically, and some places are really, lots of people have been fired and let go and so on. I think this is a bad mistake that they will pay a big price for in the future. But I think it's more of an economic decision than a political one. And clearly the sons of bin Zayed Sheikh Zayed are not as pro-Palestinian and as committed to the Arab causes as their father was.
Osamah, do you think that this will in some way backfire? Or do you think the people will just accept this?
Well, no, and I think one of the things that's important to remember, and I think you've heard some of this already, is that the Palestinian Authority itself is sitting in, for example, this is really a negation of what Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas has been pushing for the past several decades. Right? He was an architect of the Oslo process. This is his failure. But it's also important to remember that he's been in power for 15 years, right? And at least 10 of them without elections. So what we're seeing is you have an unelected and an unpopular leadership that really does not have a vision or a strategy. But what really is needed here is for Palestinians to turn and say, both inside Palestine and across the world, is to say now is the time to move for full equality. The two-state solution is dead and has been dead for a long time. And the international community has demonstrated, including our former Arab brothers have demonstrated that they have no intention to put pressure on Israel to abide by international law, to abide by UN Security Council resolutions. So now is the time for Palestinians to begin for a total push towards equality for everything from civil, religious, political rights, full equality across the country for all Palestinians. So that includes Palestinians under occupation in the West Bank and Gaza, Palestinians who live in kind of a different type status who live in Jerusalem, as well as Palestinian citizens of Israel who are effectively second-class citizens of Israel. So what's needed now, to pick up on Kamel's point, is to say, one, a full endorsement of the BDS movement, and two, a movement for full equality. Otherwise, what's going to happen is we'll see further and further divisions of the Palestinians. They're already divided between the West Bank and Gaza, between these two major parties in Hamas and Fatah. And there needs to be a vision and a movement towards full equality, one that supersedes these kind of petty differences between the parties, and one that unites the Palestinian people both inside and outside of Palestine. And that's, I believe, where this is going. And I think it's going to take some time to get there. But much like we saw in apartheid South Africa and against the white minority regimes in Southern Africa, that is what we're looking at, is a full-on anti-apartheid movement that I think Palestinians will now begin to embrace fully.
That's a good point, right? Because certainly we know that divisions between Palestinians have been an issue and an obstacle for quite a while now. But then recently, there have been overtures between Hamas and Fatah and the like towards, again, reconciliation and a unity government of some sort. Will this quicken that process? Do you think that this will quicken the process of these parties being forced to come together, to work together?
Well, I think the missing ingredient are the Palestinians who live abroad, in the diaspora, in the refugee camps, and so on. Let's remember that the Palestinian Authority only operates within the Palestinian Authority area. So, in fact, there are growing moves in terms of this. One of the byproducts of the coronavirus pandemic is that there have been lots of Zoom meetings between Palestinians across the world, not hindered by borders or an inability to go to this country or that country, to discuss what they want. And what is clear is there is unanimous agreement that the PLO has got to be rebuilt. The home for everyone has got to be rebuilt. And it includes, and at the heart of it, is what is the Palestinian National Council, where there have been no proper elections since almost 1988. So it's important. And in fact, if the PLO as is, really wants to change things, it should make the best of the Palestinian people as a whole. And therefore, representation for us, for example, I couldn't tell you who my representative in the Palestinian National Council here in the UK is. Now, normally an MP, a member of parliament, you have a meeting and discuss things and tell them what you think, and they tell you what is happening in the party. Indeed. But so we need to rebuild the PLO. The issue of equality is interesting in terms of how you get to it. So there's been, again, a lot of discussion about how you reach equality with a state, with a people as a whole, who can't even see the Palestinians as worthy of even a state. So although equality is wonderful, the Palestinians want freedom, justice, and equality. The question of how we get there, we need to spend quite a lot of brain power to work out a way of getting to it.
Daoud, I'll give you the word. We just have under a minute left. I want to get your final thoughts on this. Do you think that, in the coming days, months, or even years, that Palestinians will be able to use this moment as impetus towards getting their rights? I mean, of course, this has been a fight that's been going on for so many decades now. Will this also be almost like a milestone moment within this process?
Well, I think you're right. I think that what is happening now is a big hole in the diplomatic channels that Mahmoud Abbas has been arguing for many years. I think we're now reached the end of that process, and we need the new leadership with genuine elections. I wouldn't dare to speak on behalf of all Palestinians. I think there has to be a ballot box that makes a decision of who and what and which direction. Two states, one state, confederation or not. I think all these are genuine, legitimate ideas, but they have to come from the ballot box and not from us academicians and observers. I think the key is the elections. The key is to give Palestinians a new leadership in a proper way.
Very well. We'll leave there as a word, but we, of course, appreciate Daoud, Osamah, and Kamel for their time today and for putting this into context for us and the ramifications of this decision of the United Arab Emirates to normalize ties with Israel. Where does this leave the Palestinians, right? I mean, all of the above parties, including the U.S., which was, of course, involved in coming to this normalization between these two sides, they have their domestic reasons, as all of our guests there laid out, each on an individual basis, be it economic, be it political, or whatever. But where does this leave then the Palestinians? That's the most important issue here, right? Because that's the main issue at the end of the day we're talking about here, is the occupation of Palestine and the need for the end of that in a peaceful fashion, which is, of course, just towards the Palestinian peoples, most importantly. How does that, or how will that be achieved at this point? Will the Palestinians use this then as impetus, as motivation to finally then unite between their different parties, which are at this point divided, and to somehow strengthen their hand internationally, be it through BDS or other such means that they may have at their disposal, to ensure that the world listens to their cause and comes to and gives them the right to, through free and fair elections, as Daoud there at the end said, through the ballot box, decide upon what it is exactly that they want to happen. 2 states, 1 state, a confederation, etc. All of those options should be laid out in front of them. But at the end of the day, the center focus should remain the Palestinians. All of the above parties are doing it for their own specific interests. Nevertheless, we should not forget the Palestinian cause in all of this. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss Nord Stream 2 and the U.S. sanctions threat against that Russian-German pipeline, which would bring Russian gas to Germany, make that route significantly easier. Germany is, of course, angered in the fact that the United States has threatened these sanctions, has even threatened a German port in this regard. The concern on the part of the U.S. and even some European partners possibly is that, of course, Russia would gain a lot of influence in this regard. But then again, Russia has had a lot of these sort of energy connections with Europe for a significant amount of time now, so it's not something completely new. Nevertheless, Germany would also see this as interference in some regards in its own affairs. It can decide, of course, as an independent sovereign nation, who exactly it wants to get its energy needs fulfilled through. And if it so chooses Russia, then so be it. That doesn't mean, of course, the Germans and the Russians agree on everything politically, but nevertheless, this is an important pipeline for both sides. Around $11 billion, I believe, or so has been spent building this pipeline at this time. Then there's also, throwing into the mix here, the American desire to sell its LNG, in fact, in Europe, which is apparently significantly more expensive than Russian liquefied natural gas. Is that maybe at play here as well? Let me put all these questions to our panelist, who is joining us now from Windhagen in Germany. Frank Umbach is joining us. He's the research director of the European Centre for Climate, Energy and Resource Security at King's College London. He's also executive advisor at Preventus Partners, which is based in Munich. Frank, thank you very much for your time today. What do you make of this? Because, Heiko Maas, the German foreign minister, has made it very clear he's displeased with this decision of sanctions. He's expressed that to Pompeo. Nevertheless, do you think the U.S. is gung-ho about doing everything it can to create obstacles for Nord Stream 2?
Yeah, that's true. Although the U.S. policies have not been so much surprising in a certain respect, but during the Obama era, already there was a bipartisan consensus also in the U.S. Congress to oppose these kind of pipelines for various reasons. Though one of the reasons at that time was much more politically, because this pipeline is circumventing Ukraine, which means that the traditional supplies via Ukraine will be minimized. Which means also much less revenues for the Ukrainian state budget. But it would also have allowed much more pressure from Russia on Ukraine in the case if Ukraine would be still so much dependent on Russian gas imports, which is meanwhile no longer the case. So there had always been a political dimension behind it. But I think there are also commercial reasons behind that. But the opposition of the U.S. Itself is not so much angering, but which has always been there. But it's also the way how the U.S. is adopting these policies for friends and allies. And this is something which we have seen before, and this has been challenging the traditional transatlantic ties of Germany.
You know, it's no surprise. There's been a lot of, there's been some talk, of course, of the fact that Merkel and Trump possibly do not get along as well as Trump might with other world leaders. Then there's that decision, Frank, of removing a number of troops from Germany and placing them elsewhere in Europe. All of those political realities, do you think they're playing into this? But then at the same time, I wonder on the other side, Germany, it's not like it's a weak country, right? It's an extremely powerful country within Europe, has a lot of influence at the same time. Is the U.S. in some regards playing with fire?
Oh, definitely. I think this kind of U.S. diplomacies in general, I think, is challenging the transatlantic ties. It's also hurting. It's not the way how the U.S. can talk with its allies, whether those are allies in Europe or in Asia. So, and that is, of course, a big dilemma. But one needs also to realize that the U.S. has still support within Europe because the German pipeline had never been the majority support by the EU 27 member states, nor the European Commission has supported the pipeline, and even also not the European Parliament has supported the pipeline. So in this respect, Germany is also acting against the common energy policy of the EU, and it can certainly not speak that Mr. Trump is violating here Europe's interests. It's definitely violating Germany's interests, but not Europe's interests, because the German government can't speak here in the name of Europe because it doesn't have the political support.
I'll ask you a very direct question then, Frank. In your opinion, then, do you think all of this headache is worth it for Germany?
No, it's definitely a problem. It's not so much threatening the energy security because Russia has an overall excess or export capacity of approximately 250 billion cubic meters. It's transporting 190 billion cubic meters a year, which means from a point of energy security, in a narrow sense, the pipeline is not necessary to build. Yeah. But it's definitely hurting the overall transatlantic ties, and including the economic ties, because the reaction also in the German parliament across the political spectrum is very much angering and calling for counter-sanctions on the German side, which is not something which the German government would like to adopt, because it would even increase the danger of a trade conflict, of a wider trade conflict with the US at a time when we all been hurt by the global impact of the pandemic. And so the German government is certainly not interested in an escalation of the economic ties to the US.
And just as a word then, Frank, before I let you go, how much worse is this going to get? I mean, do you think this will continue, or that both sides will be able to come to some sort of a reasonable, a solution? I mean, I find that hard to believe that they would be able to, because, this is a pipeline that is already complete now, basically, and will possibly start, operations fairly soon in the near future.
Yeah, I still suspect. I personally have always been against the pipeline for a variety of reasons, and the major reason has been it violates the common energy policy of the EU because we don't have the political support or the majority support within the EU. But overall, I think this is really, really dangerous. The German government have called for with some kind of argument, finding a compromise, including also the willingness to build up and to finance also, to support the finance of 2 LNG terminals in Germany for the very first time, because we don't have any kind of an LNG import terminal up to now. But the US government and part of the US Congress are really being willing to escalate everything. And that is really, really dangerous, because at the very end, even the European Commission being against the pipeline will be siding with the German government. And then we will have not just an economic escalation between Germany and the US, but even the EU is drawn into this conflict and into a wider economic conflict with the US. And that's definitely not the interest of the EU nor the German government.
Indeed. Well, we'll leave those for Frank, but we sincerely appreciate you taking your time out to share your thoughts with us on this and sharing your expertise with us. That was Frank Umbach speaking to us there from Windhagen in Germany. This Nord Stream 2 pipeline issue is not a new one, certainly. Just the entire energy connections and the energy sales from Russia into Europe have been an issue for a while now. Nevertheless, this pipeline specifically does circumvent, as Frank there correctly said, Ukraine. So that entire issue of Ukraine and the West's, of course, displeasure about annexation of Crimea and other such activities of Russia vis-a-vis Ukraine are something that this sort of then circumvents that entire issue altogether and possibly puts significant more pressure on Ukraine because it completely bypasses that country altogether regarding that energy supplies into Europe. Should Germany stick by this at this time? Is all of this political headache worth it? Are these sanctions worth it? Germany would argue, listen, we're a sovereign nation. We can do as we please. We can buy energy from whom we so please. But as Frank also then correctly said, this is also dividing Europe. So it's not like the rest of Europe is on board with Germany. But then at the same time, does America have the right to come in and tell European countries what they can and cannot do? Does America have the right to sanction anybody who buys Russian energy, possibly because it wants to sell its own LNG to them? Those are all, of course, open-ended questions and something that should be debated at this time as well. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, an investigation has shown, coming out of Africa more specifically, operations of U.S. Special Forces on the continent. Now, a lot of these operations are quite secretive, as most such special operations forces operations are around the world. But when it comes to the African continent itself, the U.S. activities there, military activities more specifically, have always seemingly been very secretive and aren't really discussed that openly in international media, at least, or in mainstream media at the very least. And this, of course, includes around 22, I believe it is, African countries at this time where U.S. Special Operations Forces, known as SOF forces, are currently deployed, including Nigeria and Somalia, and et cetera, et cetera. We do hear of Somalia every so often because that country is in significant upheaval at this point. But nevertheless, those host countries certainly have deals with the SOF forces, but it's the people, it's the Africans themselves who are not given the information about exactly what is happening. Now, of course, in the face of it, we know that all of the above activities by the U.S. Special Operations Forces are done as counterinsurgency, counterterrorism, anti-narcotics, et cetera, et cetera. So it all seems like very legitimate causes, but then why hide it? Why do this in a very secretive fashion at this point in time? Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Ovigwe Eguegu, who is the founder of Afripolitical, an African geopolitical intelligence firm. He's also a contributor at the Africa Report. He's joining us now from Abuja in Nigeria. Ovigwe, thank you very much for your time today. What do you make of this investigation? How significant is it for Africans themselves to know what is going on when it comes to these sorts of forces and their countries?
Yeah, thanks for having me. So when the report came out, I think for a very long time, we've always known that these African countries have military cooperations and partnership with the U.S. And in many instances, they are announced. For instance, you would find there was an uproar just a few years, I think about 2 years ago, about a U.S. military installation in Ghana, and that led to several drew criticism from civil society organizations and just regular citizens. So these are even actual hard structures that were announced publicly. So to even hear that there are special operations going on in the background, yes, it's a shock to many, but it doesn't surprise some segment of society because we are used to this valorization of a U.S. counterterrorism operation, in Africa. So people are not really, or generally speaking, those in the policy community or the policy circle, they are not really critical of this, these activities enough. So most of the time, it's just regular average African citizens that are really taking this, quite seriously.
You know, Ovigwe, as you well know, there's so many reports that come out of Somalia every so often about civilians being killed because of AFRICOM, strikes or drone strikes, etc. As collateral, quote unquote, damage in the fight against militants there. And of course, we know that there is a militant issue even where you're sitting in Nigeria as well. Do you think that if the U.S. is of course involved in possibly those legitimate operations, that it should be more transparent, that the public should know more about this?
Yeah, I think the issue of transparency, that responsibility primarily lies with the African governments themselves. So if they are the ones reaching these deals, with in the United States, and I'm assuming that these special operations, they're actually done with the authorization from the African government, because we can't really say. They can just pop in and pop out, without really involving the African countries. But in the African, I think the responsibility is on the African government to actually sensitize or inform their citizens that this kind of cooperation is ongoing. So when it comes to transparency, like I said, we can put pressure on the United States to come out very clearly what it's doing in the continent of Africa, but the African government also themselves still have their responsibility. Let's take the example of Niger in 2017, where 4 U.S. special operations combatants were killed. You find there was this uproar in the United States, but almost nothing from Niger itself, because most of the time people are not even aware of what's going on, or they don't even follow up to know the implications of these operations. But for those who are in the policy community, the responsibility is on us to actually understand that you just can't have this type of easy access or shadow operations going on without people's awareness, because just about anything can be done under the veneer of fighting terrorism.
And then there's the human rights concerns, right? Of course, I mean, we can talk about the human rights concerns just on the U.S. involvement, as you correctly there said, of course. But then there's also just human rights concerns about many of these African governments that the U.S. may possibly be working with, or at least in those nations that the U.S. is operating, especially in the Sahel region. We can talk about various, human rights issues there. Those are also very important to highlight, aren't they?
Yes, they are. I mean, I think one of the most important, aspects to the counterterrorism operation, especially, and for anywhere in the world, especially in Somalia, where we really hear of U.S. drone strike, is, the responsibility. They always talk about the responsibility to protect. For instance, that was what was used, in the Libya full-scale Libya invasion by NATO. What about the responsibility? To respect, human rights, because you find, cases where people are killed, civilians are killed, time and time again, and almost nothing is being done. For instance, in Afghanistan, we see that almost even more frequent than in Somalia, and then you have the ICC and then Pompeo coming out straight to threaten. Not just the prosecutors, but also their families. I mean, that's the kind of thing you really hear from places like North Korea. So when we're talking about transparency, I think the U.S. wants from another side is not, in ICC investigation, and even in Somalia, we should even, interrogate his activities there more closely. I'm sure, there's going to be a lot of, ruffled feathers. So when we're talking about transparency, yes, we want the African government to really speak out to inform their citizens. But I think also because of the cost of this, counterterrorism operation, the U.S. itself might not even be willing to be more transparent, or because there are a lot of things that it might not want, the public to find out, whether the American public or the African public.
Very well. I believe there's a final word of Eguegu, where we sincerely appreciate your taking your time out and sharing that very important insight with us about what exactly is happening vis-a-vis the U.S. role across Africa through these special operations forces, the SOF, or, of course, other such activities of the U.S. Why is it building bases at a time when China is, in fact, trying to help many of these African countries, at least on the public face of it, through trade or otherwise? Is that enough of a reason for the U.S. to be involved in these spaces? Why isn't there further transparency about U.S. dealings with these host governments that it's involved with in apparently, again, counterinsurgency, counterterrorism, anti-narcotics, etc., anti-human smuggling operations, all of the above seem like, of course, very legitimate reasons. So if they're all legitimate, and if all of the above is clean-cut operations, why not be more transparent about it? Why be so secretive about it? And why then isn't more of the international media, mainstream media, discussing this sort of thing? Why is Africa still being overlooked when it comes to this U.S. role in the region? Is it because the U.S. is so involved in other places in the world, which make better headlines, be it in the Middle East or East Asia, et cetera? Or is it just that, again, there's other reasons that Africa is being overlooked simply because the public would be okay with this, or is there just not enough awareness about this issue at this time as well? I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.